So I come to my third lecture. In the last lecture, I ended with the first attempt of Jimmy to achieve something on his own. But Jimmy was far away from being successful. The felt instrument he worked with broke through. He put all broken things in a so-called experimental pot. This pot was continually enriched with other things, and Jimmy mixed the things together with clay. The pot became a shapeless, stinking mass over the time. What Jimmy showed by making things indefinable is that he took away the specific features. That is to say, Jimmy revealed his regressive thinking. He eliminated all kinds of differences. In the treatment room, he took away the handle grip of a locker. Now he's a hermaphrodite, he said. Very soon, he transferred his wish to eliminate differences to gender of boys and girls. He talked about his pleasant invention to eliminate all he's and she's among his classmates. We are all talking of it has, it does, and so on, when we are speaking of each other in class, and everybody has its pleasure, he boasted. Jimmy made clear that in fantasizing everything and everybody as hermaphrodites, he cancelled a lot of laws at the same time. There is no why, no when, no how, no causality, no sexual identity. There are also no laws of the language. Language and writing stand normally for cultural evolution, and they symbolize paternal law and authority. Here again we see the already mentioned displacement. The real father remains unaffected by his oppositional feelings, but these affects are directed against language, writing, and other authorities. In the tendency not to discriminate between cause and effect, he eliminates also the significance of the father for the child. This idea was first formulated by Grimberger in 1983, and really it hits the nail on the head in the case of Jimmy. Jimmy was lacking in benevolent identifications with father and his values. He had not internalized the early experience of being protected by a strong father and caringly loved by him, as Bloss had pointed out in 1990. But just such pre-Oedipal identifications of trust and security would have reduced the threat of retaliation by this restraining and punishing father figure of the Oedipal period. So, in treatment, the sexual development looked like becoming an overwhelming experience of catastrophic proportions. Physically, he was entering puberty without even having achieved a level of ego development appropriate for a latency child. I will not go into all details about his sexual development with his transference aspects. I want to discuss those aspects of working through leading to changes in his ego development and finally to progress in reading and writing capacities. Before starting to show the very important stages of this process, let us have a look at the aggressive stage of ego development that Jimmy demonstrated with emphasis on the role the slightly older brother played in the course of Jimmy's development. Jimmy's brother experience seemed to support some aspects of complacency. On the one side, the brother gave Jimmy the feeling to make common cause with a negative attitude against authority persons. So Jimmy voiced, "Teachers are to be there to be bothered." And this is the same at the secondary school where my brother is pupil. About the other aspect of complacency provided by the brother, Jimmy boasted, "My brother does everything for me I'm not good at. He reads everything to me that I want to know about. It's a very good thing to have such a brother." It will be interesting to see how Jimmy will change his statements about his brother later on in therapy. But what Jimmy appeared to gain up to know from his passive, regressive participation in others' achievements was a part of their strength as well as an avoidance of unpleasant feelings of envy and anger. He found also other ways of avoiding making his own efforts by bullying younger children into working for him or paying them to do his work for him. Other ways of dealing with his helplessness and dependency were his obstreperousness and rebellion in the face of authority. When not engaged in noisy rebellion, he would lapse into passive resistance and withholding, as for instance by refusing to show his bus pass to the conductor or refusing to cooperate with teachers' instructions. "I'm not going to let him earn any money off me." In this way, Jimmy showed his tendency to castrate every authority. Meanwhile, in treatment, he was boasting of his insolence. "I've got the world's most cheek. Nobody is as cheeky as me. If anybody behaved as badly as I do here, I'd throw them out and no mistake." "Yes," I responded, "and you are really disappointed that I'm not doing that to you. You've got this fantasy of people constantly needing someone to watch them for fear or something awful happening if they are not watched. But I see our task in trying to find out why it is that you, with all your intelligence and talent, always seem to have to destroy so much in your life. Instead of putting your gifts in the service of learning, all you do is to use them for rebellion." The next time in treatment, Jimmy seemed torn between clinging desperately to maneuvers stemming from his anal universe, which had supplied him with narcissistic gratifications, and the beginning of awareness of and confrontation with his real narcissistic wants. As Jimmy developed physically, he showed many forms of expressing masturbation anxiety. By interpretation, I aimed first at relieving some of Jimmy's anxieties over masturbation. I explained that if one felt lonely, one often felt the need to turn to one's own body for comfort. For example, I said, "Just like when you throw away your anorak here, it looks as if you were trying to get rid of a bit of skin you hate, or that seems dangerous." Jimmy seemed to understand at once. "Shut up," he yelled. "None of your business what I do in bed at night." On the one side, Jimmy defended against my interpretations. On the other side, his nonverbal and later his verbal material about his sexual feelings increased. The more he gained orientation about the normality of masturbation, he could tolerate sexual feelings and thoughts. Meanwhile, a great deal of pleasurable anal messing continued. For example, he liked painting with his fingers. I had given the permission for smearing on the washable surface of the table in the room. Suddenly, out of his smearing, he began to paint letters like a little child on the table, and then whole words appeared. The orthography of the words was correct. I pointed to this by appreciating his correct writing and smiled. But Jimmy's painting ended always in a grey mess because he mixed different colors together. I had the impression that it was not always intended, observing his disappointment in his eyes. So I commented that it looked sad that every painting ended in a grey mess. He wondered how I ever managed to clean it off. I explained that it was quite easy with a special kind of cleaning pad, and he decided that in future he would undertake this chore. It seemed to provide him with a compromise between a compulsion for anal messing and a wish for control and mastery, which in turn afforded him some feeling of self-esteem. Another day he asked for green paint. I suggested mixing yellow and blue. Looking at the emerging green color in amazement, he asked, perplexed, "Where did you learn this kind of thing about colors?" One of the next hours, just after having repeated his experience of creating green color, it happened again that he gave black color to his green. Aghast, he stared at the emerging grey mess. But he was able to say for the first time, "I didn't consciously want to destroy anything. I didn't want that to happen at all. It must have been my unconscious." I commented, "I think you have made an important finding, important also for other things you don't want to happen, perhaps for mistakes." Jimmy remained thoughtfully silent. In future sessions, he demonstrated eagerness for knowledge. One day, he asked for a certain journal about landscape and animals. Having the journal, he began to read aloud to my surprise. When a word seemed difficult for him, he looked at me, and I gave him an encouraging glance. Then he continued and was successful in grasping the word. Eventually I said, "I see you can." Jimmy remained concentrated even when there were very difficult words in the text. He seemed to need only my patiently looking and listening at him, adding sometimes an encouraging and praising statement. For many weeks, Jimmy continued in this way and found pleasure in his exercises. Perhaps this progress could lead to speculate. At this stage of treatment, now we have done it. But the credit alone Jimmy sought for, in my eyes, was not all he needed therapeutically. There were still other feelings behind his progressive wishes. One has to realize that Jimmy had begun to experience and live through sadness and narcissistic heart and rage, as well as massive envy. This became manifest on the transference level and outside the treatment situation. Jimmy approached more and more his early traumatic experiences. But in the following material we will see that Jimmy's fantasies and actions are now in contrast to those of his early toddler situation. His feelings are now colored from his actual psychosexual level of development. In the outer world of Jimmy, a new situation came into being. Together with his brother, he began to undergo religious instructions in preparation for their confirmation. This was a moment for Jimmy to discover another side of his brother. What looked like his brother's two-faced nature began to dawn on Jimmy. He complained with undisguised anger and disappointment. The double-dealing clever prick, talking dirty about the vicar and during instruction playing Holy Joe. Then Jimmy went on telling a story about an ape, aping a mustachioed man. I commented that with this story he was telling me something about what aping or imitating meant to him. His reply was like a shot of a barrel. Learning is nothing but imitation, that's all. Others are all hypocritical clever plots. Is it really nothing but hypocritical cleverness, I asked in return, in showing a skill you have acquired because at one time it has given you pleasure? Perhaps you feel everyone has always been grudging you the pleasure in the past. After a moment of silence, I continued, you know, I think it's every bit as hypocritical of you always to hide what you really can do. Jimmy's reaction to this and other similar interpretations was always defensive, but his expression conveyed all sorts of emotions beginning to stir. In our conversations, Jimmy made the expression hypocritical to a familiar word. Ideas of hypocrisy and sham preoccupied him. Anything was labeled hypocritical. For example, a new picture he noticed in the treatment room. One day, leafing through a calendar, he came across a quotation by La Rochefoucauld. We have more power than willpower. As an excuse for our lack of achievement, we persuade ourselves of its impossibility. I commented how competent he was in reading. But he immediately tore off the leaf and screwed it up. Hypocrisy, absurd, he muttered. Asked what he meant, he said, some clever dick making quick few thousand with a few clever words. His ennui seemed all pervasive. In the treatment situation, he seemed aiming to disturb my thinking and my working equipment. At first he stole some phallic objects, like a pencil and a ruler, and he called me dim, because I never seemed to notice unless he drew my attention to either missing or damaged things. I pointed to his wrongdoing in his thieving activities and asked him to return the stolen things. But he answered that he had given them away to his siblings. His feeling was that he was justified in doing so. I knew from his mother about fair shares within the family, and this was appreciated. But I also felt that on a deeper level he aimed to break my omnipotence with which he had invested me, the mother figure. The material of taking things away increased. I had a shrub outside the front door. Before coming in, he broke little twigs off my shrub. I said, some things always got to be taken away from somebody. Jimmy exploded. If you were a man, I'd kick you in your things. His wish to castrate men was displaced onto me, but perhaps I stood for men and women he wished to castrate. Another day, he appeared with a large branch which I recognized as belonging to a shrub from a neighbor garden. I said, they seem so harmless, these little pranks of yours, but I get the feeling that they must mean a great deal to you. Perhaps the secretiveness gives you a sense of power. I think, and I was interrupted, I think I didn't get any further because Jimmy interrupted me by slamming the branch down on the table like a whip, then stopping and asking, and what have you got to say to that chapter and verse? You're cutting off my words, I replied. Is that what happens in school? Perhaps you are cutting off your own words when you are writing. Jimmy remained thoughtfully silent, but a smiling boy left at the end of the session. He had left various objects lying around on the floor, commenting I used to be far more untidy before now." He demonstrated in this way that he was able to get some distance to his behavior and to be more reflective. Also, in his family, he had entered a phase during which he attempted to assert some independence, and sometimes succeeding. Parents reported that he had changed. They felt he had become more difficult in relation to father and brother, and that he seemed constantly trying to compete with them. He was also said to attempt to stand up for his rights in small things. And it appeared that he now sought out father more than hitherto, and father responded positively. Occasionally they would go out together gathering mushrooms. In treatment, he reported on an essay. He sounded quite optimistic, proudly telling me that, in his special class, he had never made so few mistakes, only 28, and 10 of them only through oversight. This may still look as a high number of mistakes, but that it seems to be such a progress for him, let us know how great the number of mistakes must have been before. An ensuing period of calm was only of short life. Feelings of rivalry emerged. This was triggered by the fact that Jimmy had arrived very early for one of his sessions. So he saw another child, a younger girl, leaving me. I heard him saying hello to the girl, but the girl did not answer. He banged around the room, full of hate and complaints of the other patient. Suddenly he sat down and resorted to the teddy bear and exclaimed, "He's going to have an operation on his head," while looking hateful and punishing at me. Then he said, "I'd really like to kill you." I replied, "I'm sure what you're demonstrating and saying here must have a special meaning." Jimmy continued, poking around inside the bear's head, commenting, "That's his brain." And what happened? What would happen if that were a real brain, I asked. "Some pretty awful disturbances," he replied, and threw the teddy bear in a corner. He continued, looking watchful at me and asked nearly every minute the time. I interpreted, "I have the impression you must verify with your many questions if my brain is still functioning, if it is not me having awful disturbances, and finally that everybody's words are not so powerful." I have to underline the magic belief in words and ideas was throughout the treatment very strong and had ever to be worked through. Just the wishful fantasy to kill me arose whenever within the transference I became a source of unbearable feelings and ideas. But in a similar way, the hatred of dyslexic children may be directed against other sources of things like school or the letters. Often I heard children of my studies saying, "I would like to kill the letters." Another child made scrawls fantasizing, "Letters don't exist anymore." Now, in the case of Jimmy, he had overcome this phase of hatred against the letters, but his material shows that he still makes mistakes. What are the reasons? Let us first come back to his symbolic action of brain operation. It is worth to reflect on its meaning, which to my understanding was not a single one. To me it seemed that Jimmy's aggression was not only directed against me, but also against the other child and the brain as the organ for thinking. Jimmy wanted the unhindered entrance to my practice, symbolically the body of the mother. The other child had been in his way. for his hate of rivals, there had been already hints in many occasions before. Following the ideas of Chasquet-Smirgel in 1987, the aggression against the head can be understood as a displacement from the body to the head, and in the head may be equated brain and fetus. At the same time, this aggression may be seen as directed against thinking representing the reality principle, and as such it stands as well in analogy to the status of the father with his procreating function, and just this is difficult to tolerate for Jimmy. This fits with the fact that Jimmy had articulated earlier within the transference really unrestrained sexual demands on the mother object. Now I'd like to speak about the day after his brain operation. Jimmy came to his session having slightly hurt his hand and being in a depressive mood. He complained about many mistakes in a dictation. I interpreted his heart and his mistakes as a punishment he had unconsciously given to himself because he might have had a bad conscience because of his operation yesterday. Jimmy seemed to accept my interpretation. Probably this was only one aspect of his punishment to himself. The following material revealed two sides of Jimmy showing their interplay in parallel. That is to say, on the one side, Jimmy appeared as the suffering one, who wrote so many mistakes. On the other side, he found ways and means to use his verbal language in an omnipotent and anal sadistic manner. He demonstrated in school and with me his potent language in a marked competing way. In school, he was dueling in terms of a strong flow of words with his classmates. He boasted questions are fought off with counter-questions to lead your enemy into a trap. He displayed an aggressive, know-it-all attitude. When I tried to get a word in edgewise, he reacted in a way as if he would express to be or not to be. He trembled and yelled, "Pushy!" Then he went on speaking in a menacing voice that in school he had cut short everybody. The shit of others is not of interest to me. I shit on it. In this castrating behavior, Jimmy showed that he acted in counter-aggression against anyone cutting him short. Now, in contrast to his early childhood, he acted in identification with his competing brother, making others to the victim he had been. So, my interpretations aimed to prepare this insight for him. I said, for example, that he was doomed with my speaking as he had experienced in earlier times, perhaps. It took a certain period of working through and mourning about his youth that had been so different from that of his brother until he could speak about. Jimmy also confessed to have had ideas of suicide. But he had given up that idea for not making his parents unhappy. In his memories, there had been really a pointed rivalry between the siblings. Jimmy said, it was not only that he cut me short, but also when I took a pencil or something like that for drawing, he stroked through what I tried to make. Then I tried doing the same to him, but I was not so successful. I remembered his many unconscious undoings of anything positive and creative he had done before. Little by little I could explain him that in his writing there came together an unconscious aggression against himself and his words as well as his suffering side, and that both sides were into him he had internalized. Jimmy reacted thoughtfully. If it is so, that would be finding pearls in oysters. We reached this point in the last year of treatment. During this period, it happened that Jimmy confirmed what I had said about his both sides by actions, for example, like binding himself on hand and foot after having been successful in reading. But then we could smile together without words. He did not speak about his writing until one day he seemed ill of despair. He complained about head itches and that he was unable to write an essay for school. His thinking seemed blocked. He paced back and forth in the room and presented a picture of poor old suffering Jimmy. What was the matter? Being asked about the theme of the essay, he finally could label that it was about a picture of a child in a poor country of the third world. I can't bear it. You don't see any green, nothing as a hungry little child being damned to live this way without hope. I got the impression that he identified unconsciously with this child. What the photo expressed seemed to remember his past when he was without hope. I said, yes, I'm sorry too for such a child, but you are not this child. And suddenly Jimmy cried out, oh yes, I'm not an illiterate person. He sat down and spontaneously wrote his essay. Having ended, he gave it to me for reading. It was the first time he gave me a written paper from himself. I found his essay short, but full of inspiration, and he had written without the dyslexic mistake. I said that I could not judge as a teacher, but that I personally found good and interesting what he had written. Jimmy answered, I feel now, I have my own thoughts, and that is a good feeling. Some days later he reported that he had got a good mark for his essay in school. I will terminate here my report on Jimmy with an account of an encounter years later. When Jimmy was a young adult, I happened to meet him, and he told me that he was studying a social profession and wrote pages and pages without mistakes. Before his new professional studies, he had been a successful craftsman. Summary. The case report proved the healing process of dyslexia and dysgraphia. Psychoanalytic work in this case was primarily directed at giving the patient the feeling of being understood. Hansi Kennedy saw this therapeutic function in analogy with the understanding of a mother who normally understands her little child before the child is able to understand himself. This helped the patient not only to develop affect regulation, but also to the ripening of processes in other personality areas, being hitherto in arrest and inhibition of development. By this I mean the processes of symbolization and mentalization, as well as the whole ego structure. The gaining of insight for the patient was prepared, and his impetus for participating in the analytic work. Under the given circumstances, the current development of puberty involved a severe crisis which could be mastered by the therapeutic work. The working through of this crisis allowed also to analyze the unconscious defense against his intellectual wishes and needs, like reading and writing, together with his early traumatic experiences. This relieves the patient from his dyslexia. Nonetheless, it is important to underline that some preconditions are necessary in support of successful and optimal outcome of psychoanalytic treatment. What are these preconditions? First, there are some from the parental side. They must cooperate throughout treatment. They must care for attendance of the child. They must be able to supporting changes in the child's development. Here, the cooperation with the therapist also includes readiness for advising and supporting help. Otherwise, severe parental pathology would indicate treatment of the parents themselves by another therapist. Finally, there is always the problem of payment, which may be handled differently in many countries. Another question arises in regard to the child's side. Viewing the case of Jimmy, it is important to stress that the parents seem to have given him a good first year of life. This was also confirmed by the treatment. In terms of brain development, they must have given him, at least during this time, good enough stimulation contained in multiple interactions like intentional two-way communication. This means the communication consists in reading and expressing gestures and emotion, like Greenspan and Schenker in 2004, or what Nahera in 2001 quoted from SCORE as face-to-face interactions. This is believed to bring about the sprouting of dopamine releasing axon terminals connecting the midbrain with the prefrontal cortex. There remains still another question. Where are the limits of effective psychoanalytic work? This is difficult to answer. All of the mentioned preconditions for effective treatment point by the same token on the other side of the coin. They point to the limits of bringing about help. One is always to verify what can be done in spite of limited conditions. Sometimes therapy can help to some degree, even when the conditions are not all of the best. I will come to the psychodynamic factors. I come back to the case of Jimmy herewith. The treatment and report point to the outstanding role played by emotional components in dyslexia. This is alike in all dyslexic patients I've seen and treated or supervised. But the clinical material from Jimmy reveals emotionally neglecting and traumatizing experiences in early childhood, leading to a break-off of his ego development. Especially the emotional withdrawal of the father was of far-reaching significance. The first consequence was avoiding of autonomous strivings and the tendency to cling on mother and brother, and later to evoke brother as a proxy for intellectual wishes. By this, his defense mechanisms contributed to a distorted perception of himself and that of objects. So his self could not develop normally, but became a very poor one. Now, what are the consequences for enrolling in an elementary school? I will summarize in the following 8 theoretical points. Point 1. A child going to school is confronted with all demands of reality. But Jimmy, with his regressive compensatory defense system and his distorted perception of himself, could not cope with the new situation. Point 2. Moreover, the demands of school to write and to read actualized early traumatic experiences with the spoken language, and dyslexia emerged. This is best explained by psychotraumatic theory. Here I refer to Fisher and Riedesser in 2003, and I try to simplify. The early experiences with the spoken language had their coming back with all the overwhelming emotions involved when trying to use the written language. The choice of the symptom has multiple determinants. It is determined by the historical givens, the experiences of the traumatic situation, but also by the individual feeling of security. So, on the one side, dyslexia lends himself for the return of the stored experiences. On the other side, the symptom offers a measure of compensatory safety. As mentioned earlier, dyslexia is an accepted symptom everywhere and brings a special care and attention from the outer world. In the case of Jimmy, the symptom brought him also the attention from father. Point 3. During the ongoing process of development in treatment, the defense of affects increased. Also, the arrest at the anal level was prominent. Omnipotence and aggression as defenses were operative in order to maintain some narcissistic balance. The defense was directed against the paternal law and symbol system. Both had to be destroyed. Point 4. With entering in puberty, the early traumatic scenarios were considered new and gained a new significance. This becomes understandable through Freud's concept of Nachträglichkeit in traumatic processes. There's no word in English for Nachträglichkeit, I think, but it means a bit like belated or afterwards. In French it is called après coup. This concept means that memories of earlier experiences are later remodeled in connection with new experiences and a new level of development. In the case of Jimmy, this was his entering in the adolescent process. Point 5. The spoken language of Jimmy showed that language was used as vehicle and representative of a pre-Oedipal and anal sadistic colored Oedipus complex. Further on, the early adolescent development reveals the connection to the traumatic experiences by showing enormous castration anxiety and the symbolic equation between speech, stool and phallus. The identification with the aggressor came to the fore. From this position, the strivings for dominant speaking emerged in order to dominate and castrate other partners. Now the others had to feel helpless. It was just the exchange of roles, what had happened in the past. Point 6. The speech used with the fantasy of omnipotence served also as reality testing. That is to say, to reassure himself as well as demonstrating to the others, I'm not castrated, but I'm autonomous against imagined suggestions and manipulations from the outer world. Point 7. The polarities of castration and masochistic victim were not only reflected in the relationships of the dyslexic, but both of these positions had been internalized as unsolved conflict. So, the sadistic defensive use of the speech pointed to the externalization of the sadistic masochistic conflict. When in relation to others, the dyslexic had the position of the sadistic aggressor, the masochistic side of him was present in the helpless victim. Corresponding to this, we saw later in the analytic process both positions being simultaneously at work in the dyslexic himself. When consciously trying to be constructive in his own activities, his unconscious aggression against his own reading and writing became visible. That is to say, in reading and writing, sometimes generalized in other areas, castration and autocastration occurred at the same time. I have to underline the same mechanisms being at work in dyslexia are to be found again in the object relationships of the dyslexic in general. The psychoanalytic treatment revealed also severe depression, including ideas of suicide behind the aggressive defense. Finally, there was a mourning process to work through, when the boy began to compare his own school career with that of his brother. Point 8. So all these determinants of dyslexia make normally their appearance isolated from the affective and psychogenetic origin. This is valuable also for other examples. They always appear isolated from the affective and psychogenetic origin. They are only to discover and to be worked on by psychoanalytic treatment. Now I will present a further outlook for other cases. Very shortly, but perhaps it helps to see what I mean. Now I will give this outlook for other affective, psychogenetic and or traumatizing origin. As I have mentioned throughout my lectures, there are many other conditions possible for bringing about the symptom of dyslexia. In my case material, as well as in other literature, I found some differences in the severity of the affective and psychogenetic origin. Consequently, it is dependent on the reached developmental level at the emergence of dyslexia, if the treatment of dyslexia is easier or more difficult. Dyslexia may be due to different neurotic conflicts without early neglecting and traumatizing experiences, but with some weakness in the ego development. Dyslexia may also come into being after achievement of competence in reading and writing. This occurs as immediate reaction after a traumatic event. I have seen this phenomenon when a parent died. But naturally, not every child develops the symptom after personal loss, parental loss. So also in such a case, one has to look out for other components, for example, how the child is experiencing the still living parent and his actions. One has also to think of some weakness on the side of the ego development of the child. This could explain the quick tendency to become traumatized and to regress in ego achievements. There was one case with an emerging dyslexia in an 11-year-old boy when father was absent for some months of professional reasons. The boy felt left and was afraid of the danger that father could not return. That he felt so had to do with his Oedipal ties to his mother and all his feelings around the Oedipus complex. For him too, the coping with Oedipal feelings was so difficult because his affect regulation and affect mastering was impaired together with other areas of his ego development. In this case, there had been an early suffering of his legs. This was inborn. This he brought to birth, and this made necessary this gymnastic, this baby gymnastic, and this was very hard for the boy and for the mother, but because it was the boy cried, and this mother could not help. So this relationship was disturbed due to this suffering. And now quite other examples of dyslexia. I know from patients with migration background, for example, when parents ignore or can't allow themselves and their child the mourning of the lost country and the lost language. Only when there is given space for speaking about these feelings and space for still exercising the habituated language, the child may begin to sympathize with the new language and give up his opposition underlying the humiliating of the foreign language. In another case, the father of a boy was a Turk. The mother was a German who died when the boy was 12 years old. The dyslexia came into being after mother's death, when the boy wanted to go in vacation to his German grandmother. the father, being a teacher, did not allow it. It is easy to understand that here a lot of affects like aggression against the father and the feeling of being left by mother and the anxiety of being cut off from his German family world were underlying the symptom. I have also treated a child who had, for a limited time of 3 weeks, traumatizing circumstances. In his early 3rd year of life, mother had taken him to a travel in an English-speaking country to a family in friendship with mother. Mother spoke perfectly English and was happy to exercise this language with her friends. But her little boy could not cope with the situation of the strange-speaking world. He cried and cried when he was addressed to in English, holding his ears and answered, "Nein, nein, nein," what means no, no, no. The adults around him, together with his mother, felt amused and laughed. It seems that even mother did not really understand what the boy felt. When the boy was about 11 years old, he developed a dyslexia. I was told this only later. The boy was brought to me because in school he got in panic. How had I to understand this? The patient made the impression of a very intelligent and charming boy. Always friendly, he did all the talking during the hour. I felt amused, but noticed somewhat like a dominating tendency behind his behavior. After some hours I commented that he seemed to be obliged to do our conversation alone. He laughed. Then he continued announcing a story which would be very gay. And laughing, he told me the story of his reactions when hearing English in his early childhood. When I replied that now he could laugh, but when he was a little boy, it must have been shocking for him. He must have had right to cry because all of the strange speaking around him. Perhaps it would be to compare with his feelings of panic today in school. He became thoughtful and began to understand. For the first time he could describe what happened in school. When the teacher wrote only one word on the blackboard, he could follow. But from complete new sentences, he got in panic. The boy could feel the connection to his earlier feelings of being overwhelmed and helpless. We could then work on to repetition of his earlier feelings and how they were not only alive in his panic, but also in his dyslexia, where he now made new rules. It was obvious that he wrote all words in capitals, which normally are written in small letters, and vice versa. It is characteristic of the German language that the first letter of substantiva is written with capital. The roles of aggressor and victim were changed and transferred into the written language. By working on this, the boy lost his symptoms. Also, this case demonstrates how traumatic experiences own the compulsion to repetition. I have some reflections on a new etiology. All the clinical material I gave is supporting the theory of psychodynamic determinants in the symptom of dyslexia. The symptom is by no means to be seen as isolated from the personality development. So the psychoanalytic clinical findings are being in contrast to an often prevailing view that behavior disturbances and other symptoms would be secondary symptoms due to dyslexia. My etiological assumptions are to bring into agreement with neuroscientific knowledge and psychodevelopment, mental as well as psychotraumatic research.